welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 8 of The Kill File. Today we are going to talk about a man named William Bonin, aka the Freeway Phantom. Today's triggers are going to be a little rough. There will be talk about child molestation, child rape, aggressive child discipline, child murder, a few adult murders, although young adult. This one's going to be very heavy and it's a rough story, so if that is too triggering for you, there's absolutely no shame in skipping this one and coming on back next week for the next episode. Look, I don't want to do children murderers. No one does really, but there are times that either I start reading the story and I am hooked and ready to do research before I find out that they killed or hurt children, like this one. I didn't know who this was, so I didn't realize that it was children until I had started researching. I had just skipped one particular killer because of the reason that he gave. This guy was a shithead, and he said one particular reason why he killed children, and it was just too much for me. So I ended up skipping that one just to fall into this one because I didn't realize it was children. I'm not sure if I'm going to cover that guy later at a different time or not, or skip it altogether. And then this one was the next one I started reading and researching, then to find out that he was also a child killer, so that sucks. But here we are. When I skipped the last one, I forgot that I had already ordered the book about him, so I may do him down the line, but I'm definitely going to take breaks between child cases. I can usually disassociate from stories now that I'm older. I don't know if it's a trauma response to my own childhood, but even just 5 years ago, had I listened to a story like this, I would have been in a bad place for like weeks. These things can be very triggering, but in some weird, twisted way, the reason that I try to protect myself and get through them is because I feel a personal mission to share these victims' stories and give them a voice that they no longer have. I know it's weird, I know not everyone can do it or listen, and that is just fine. Just know that no one ever enjoys talking about child killers or rapists or child rapists, but I will continue to do stories as I can because I want to give these victims a light for their truth. I feel it's the least that I can do after what happened to these poor children or people, and I hope, if nothing else, we can learn a little bit from their stories or be a little more thankful for what we have. Okay, that being said, we are just going to jump right in. So, William Bonin was born on January 8th, 1947, and he was also known as the Freeway Killer. William was the middle child of 3 boys that were born to parents Robert and Alice. Robert was said to be a compulsive gambler. This is Robert, the father. He was said to be a compulsive gambler. He once gambled away their family home. And he was also physically abusive towards his wife in front of the boys and was abusive towards the boys when their mother wasn't around. It was said that both of Robert's parents were alcoholics and oftentimes the children were neglected. Now this is going back to Robert Jr. Neighbors would often look out for the boys, feeling sorry for them, so they would clothe and feed them often. Apparently, there were often times where the boys would be abandoned by both parents for long periods of time. Sometimes the boys were sent off to stay with their grandfather, who he himself was already a convicted child molester. He had apparently not only molested his own daughter, which was William's mother when she was younger, but it was also established that he ended up molesting all 3 of his grandsons as well. What a sick fuck. But also, if his mother knew that he was a convicted child molester and had molested her when she was younger, why in the world would she let her 3 sons go over there? That's so awful. This type of thing happens often, or at least it used to, and it makes me sick. It's different when you don't know, and I understand it happens, and it's awful when parents find out, and then they blame themselves, which it's not their faults, but when parents fail to protect their own children and they know that there's a chance that it can happen, it makes me want to vomit. Do better. Let's be better for our own children. Let's protect our babies to the best of our abilities. And if someone or something feels off, it probably is. Let's stop this cycle of abuse together. Then, in 1953, all 3 of the boys were sent to an orphanage which was an attempt by their mother to shield her boys from their abusive father. At least she was trying. Those types of abuse, they don't just stop. The orphanage had been known to actually punish the children in severe manners over small offenses. The discipline included severe beatings, partial drowning in water-filled sinks, and being placed in stress positions, which means positions that are stressful to the body or muscles. That's awful that these poor children had to go through this. It said that later on in life, William refused to speak about what had happened to him at the orphanage, except to admit that he would sometimes give consent to the older males if they made sexual advances towards him. He would agree if they first tied his hands behind his back. That makes me wonder the particular abuse and sexual abuse that William may have went through as a child if these are the things he was asking for. When William was 9 years old, the boys were all sent back to their parents. So all of this had happened before William even reached 9 years old. Can you imagine the mental trauma that this would cause on a child or the type of adult that this would create? It's not an excuse by any means for the things that William would go on to do at all. It's just that when you hear these kinds of cases, you feel bad for the things that they went through as children or when they were so abused, but then you have to hate them for the things that they do later on. This is why mental health is so damn important. When William was 10 years old, he would be caught stealing vehicle license plates and was sent to juvenile detention. There, he was also allegedly abused, both sexually and physical, by multiple people, and one of these people was said to be his counselor. If this is true, this is absolutely disgusting and infuriating. No wonder we had so many serial killers in the 60s through the 80s. Abuse on top of abuse on top of abuse. It's just sick. William's family decided to move out to sunny California in the year of 1961, mostly because there was a foreclosure on their family home that was bound to happen at some point. Shortly after moving to California, William's father died from cirrhosis of the liver. It said that William went on to molest not only his younger brother, but also many children in the neighborhood. It said he would make false promises to the kids of supplying them alcohol to lure them to his home. Okay, here's my question. I know this is a side note, and I might have a few in this episode. I have questions. My question of this part is, if this is still in 1961, or even in 1962, then William is at the age of like 14 or 15 years old at this time. So we have seen this a lot in families, and it actually is quite normal for children to have sexual curiosity when they're younger and experiment with each other and even other family members. You may or may not have already known this, but it's actually extremely common, especially if the older kid has had something done to them from an older kid. So my question to you guys is, or whoever, is like, at what age does it go from curiosity to molestation? Like, I know from the mouth of a therapist personally that around 4 years age difference is what is quote unquote normal. And the further you get from that number in age difference, the more different that will be. So if William, let's say, were to have done things when he was 15 to a kid that was 9, does that mean at that point that he was molesting the child? Does that make him a predator at that age? And what about the fact that he's still a child himself? This is where it's hard for me because although all of this is awful, I don't feel like it's completely William's fault at this young age because so many of the adults in his life had abused him. And this is all he knows. This could be the only way that he knows how to show intimacy at this age. Full of hormones and curiosity, he may not have realized the impact of what he was doing or the impact that those things would have had on the other children. I'm not defending his adult actions or even his actions now at this time. I'm just curious, where does that line draw? I don't know. I mean, it's all fucked up. I realize that I'm just always fascinated by the psychology behind these things, as it's happened to so many of us out in the world, especially as children. William went on to graduate from high school in 1965, and he actually became engaged not long after. This engagement was mostly due to his mother insisting that he get engaged because she had concern about William's sexual preference for males. She had thought that if he had married a woman, that these preferences would go away. Doesn't work that way, Alice. But I understand back then, they may not have known better. William joined the Air Force the same year that he graduated high school, and he eventually ended up serving in active duty in the Vietnam War. He was an aerial gunner, and he actually had logged over 700 hours of patrol time and combat time while he was in Vietnam. At some point during the war, William actually risked his own life to save his fellow airmen that had been wounded. Because of this action, he received a Good Conduct Medal. William later in life would say that he felt his time in the Vietnam War made him actually believe that human life was overrated. Yikes. William also claimed to have had sexual relations with both men and women while he was in Vietnam. He also claimed to have sexually assaulted 2 soldiers at gunpoint during the Tet Offensive. I didn't know what the Tet Offense was, so I did a quick Goog, and it said that the, quote, Tet Offensive was a series of surprise attacks by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces against South Vietnam that had began on January 30th, 1968 during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year or Tet holiday, end quote. I'm going to call myself out right now, and I'm going to tell you that I am absolutely awful at history, and I wish that I had paid more attention to my, albeit misogynistic and women-hating teacher. He was all I had, so I wish that I would have listened to him lecture instead of just sitting there stewing about how much I hated him. After 3 years in the Air Force, William was honorably discharged in 1968, and he moved back to his mother's house, and soon after, he married his fiancée. The marriage didn't last long, though, and not long afterwards, they would get divorced. This same year, William embarked on a string of sexual assaults against 5 children that were aged 12 to 18. In the earlier part of 1969, he was arrested and then charged with multiple offenses against each of these victims. He pled guilty to the charges, and then he was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital. Sorry if I butchered that. He was then considered to be a, quote, mentally disordered sexual offender who would not respond to treatment, end quote. While William was in the hospital, they gave him many assessments and examinations that would show that he had a higher than average IQ, and he also had exhibited traits of manic depression, which I thought was bipolar disorder, no? After this, the staff had discovered that William had damage to his prefrontal cortex of his brain, which is said to mean that he was unable to restrain himself from violent impulses, which is freaking scary. And I've heard this time and time again with serial killers. While William was in the hospital, he repeatedly engaged in forced sexual activities with his fellow male inmates, which is just so sad. I wanted to know more like if the men were able to speak up about the abuse, or were they mentally handicapped and just being taken advantage of? Oh, it's awful. Either way, it's awful. After being deemed untreatable, William was sent to prison. In 1974, so just 5 years after he had been arrested and put into the hospital where they deemed him untreatable, William was deemed by the courts or prison or whatever that he was no longer a danger to himself or others, so the authorities released him from prison. I do not understand this. Why? He was deemed untreatable at a hospital, and they even knew that his frontal cortex had damage and that he couldn't control his violent impulses. Is that not just a killer in the making? But the prison was like, meh, you're not our problem, see you later. In 1975, just 1 year or maybe less after he was released from jail, William picked up a 14-year-old hitchhiker, and as soon as the boy had entered the vehicle, William asked if he was a homosexual. The boy was shocked by this question, so he asked William to stop the car, but instead of stopping, William pulled out a gun. He then drove to a field, trigger warning, raped and beat the boy. Afterwards, William attempted to strangle this boy with a t-shirt. When he attempted to strangle him, the boy started screaming, to which William stopped, apologized, and drove the boy home. As soon as William left the boy, he ran to his mother and told her what happened, and the authorities were called immediately. The police then charged William, and he was convicted of his crimes and spent more time in jail. This made me so mad because after this, he was released again. Like, what in the actual fuck? If this man is without impulse control and he had already raped and beat and tried to strangle a child, why is he not either locked up for life or in a mental facility for life? He's absolutely a danger to society, and it's an easy one to see this. It's so obvious that he could not control his impulses when he tried to strangle the boy, then he apologized to him. When William was again released into society, he started working as a truck driver. Meanwhile, he was gaining a reputation around teenagers and young boys that he would allow teens to essentially party at his house with alcohol. It was at this time, and through a neighbor, that William met two men. One was a 20-year-old man named Vernon Butts, and I have to tell you that when I was doing research for this case and I came across this name, I legitimately laughed out loud like a 6-year-old little girl. And when I told my boys that this guy's name was Vernon Butts and that it was a great name, they, for real, made fun of the fact that I was giggling like a child. But come on, Vernon Butts? That name is so fantastic. Anyways, he met this man along with an 18-year-old young man named Gregory Miley. Butts would later say that he was terrified and fascinated by William at the same time. He would also state that he enjoyed watching William when he would torture and then murder his victims. Fucking gross. Miley was said to also accompany William from time to time during his disgusting activities and was also a willing participant. Okay, so now we are going to move on to the murder part of William's story. Some of them are very brutal. I am also not going to give any of the names of the victims on this one. They are all children. So it was said that the kind of victims William had were male sex workers, male hitchhikers, and schoolboys, which just that sentence makes me want to punch this fucker in the face. William would either lure his victims or force them into his van, which was said to be a dingy 1972 Ford Ecoline, where he would quickly overpower these victims and tie their hands and feet with wire or handcuffs. William would then sexually assault his victims and then severely beat them. I'm going to just leave it at that. I'm trying to leave some of the worst details out because this case is seriously awful and we don't need every single detail of what the sicko did. After William assaulted and beat these poor victims, he would then strangle them, and I guess he would often use their own shirt to strangle them. Sometimes William would stab or beat them to death instead. One victim was actually killed when William forced him to drink hydrochloric acid, and 3 others had been killed from having ice picks jammed into their ear, and one had actually died from shock. It doesn't seem like William had one particular way of killing victims. It seems as though he just wanted to torture them before he killed them. William had fixed up his van in a particular way so that it would be harder for his victims to escape. He removed all of the handles from the passenger side and in the back. He also kept some of the tools and equipment in the van that he would use on his victims, and this included ligatures, knives, and different kinds of household tools. This is literally a murder van, and it's absolutely terrifying. William usually killed his victims in the back of his van, and then the victim's body would be dumped along the freeways of Southern California, hence the name, the Freeway Killer. William wasn't always one who worked alone. He usually had assistance by one of his 4 accomplices. Later on, it would be discovered that William seemed to need a bigger thrill with each of his murders, and therefore the brutality would also increase, like a hunger that is not satisfied. Now we're going to talk about the victims. So when I first started this case, I didn't know that the victims were children, and I also didn't know the sheer brutality of the murders, torture, sexual assault, and rape. As I was reading about him, it went into very disturbing details of how each victim was murdered. Instead of going through each and every case of these victims, because I think we would all literally be sick to our stomachs, I will just lightly touch on a few of the ones that stuck out, and then I will give some ages and dates so we get the picture without wanting to vomit. There was one instance that it mentioned before when we said the victim died by shock. I thought it meant like electrocution shock, but it meant the sheer brutality of sodomization that this victim had gone through because his body went into shock and it unfortunately killed him. Another one that stuck out was when William had help from his accomplice Gregory Matthews Miley, who was 18 years old. He helped him pick up a victim that was 15 years old, a young male, who had been hitchhiking. Later on, Miley would claim that William and this victim had consensual sexual relations in the back of the van while Miley drove around. William then had whispered that the, quote, kid's going to die," into Miles' ear, after which they quickly bound this victim. They robbed the victim of the $6 that he had, and then William proceeded to rape the victim. While Miley attempted to rape this victim as well, it said that he was unable to maintain his erection, so instead he assaulted the victim with sharp objects because he was pissed with frustration. The victim was then beat and strangled by William, as Miley was said to jump on the victim's chest. And unlike the other victims, this one was found in an alleyway. I wonder if his accomplice was unable to rape the victim because of something inside him knowing it was wrong, or maybe this accomplice was not gay and unable to continue, or maybe even just the sheer pressure of it. But I feel like this poor victim paid the price because Miley may have felt humiliated. I don't know if the victim would have made it out of there alive anyways. William wasn't known to let any of them go after he had started on this leg of his spree. This was something that was triggering to me though, and I was curious if any of us out there had experienced a time in your own life where someone that you were with who is angry, maybe a parent, maybe a partner, a friend, your own child, whoever, and this person is angry and they go and they do something and it doesn't work out for them. And you know deep down in your gut that it's about to get worse in that moment, because for however angry they are right in that moment, they're about to get worse because something didn't just go their way. And sheer panic goes through you for a moment, wondering how much worse it was going to be. I don't know if any of you have ever felt that way at any point or seen it on someone's face. Maybe you have. Maybe you've even done this yourselves. And when you're upset, it can be scary, but I can tell you, for those of us who have experienced this feeling of panic, wondering how bad it was about to get, and there's nothing that you can do about it, like you want to fix it for them just so they don't get more enraged, but you can't. It will only make it worse if that person feels humiliated. That feeling to me is the absolute worst. I have gone through this moment, I don't even know how many times in my life, and the utter dread that your body feels as it's happening, and it's not even your fault, is absolutely awful. I know the feeling of trying to de-escalate that situation from a parental perspective is way less intense, but it also makes me immediately calm and wanting to help my child in that moment know that it's all right and it's not a big deal, so they won't grow up to do that to someone because the feeling is absolutely terrifying. Does that even make sense? I feel like this episode is going to be pretty triggering for me, so I apologize if this episode is full of side notes and you just want me to shut the fuck up and tell the story. Feel free to share your opinion on whether you like the side notes as you take a break from the heaviness and a chance to search your own feelings and identify with those, or if you would just rather me keep the side notes to a minimum and share at the end of the story when I share my thoughts about the case. I am still learning, but I want to give the audience what they want. Okay, so back to the story. The same day that William's accomplice Miley had gotten frustrated with that victim, apparently William said he was still feeling aroused and had wanted to attack and kill again. So again, that day, they found a victim who was 12, and this one was so freaking sad because this boy had been waiting at a bus stop, and they had offered this poor kid a ride to Disneyland, and of course the boy got in because who doesn't want to go to Disneyland? And he met the same unfortunate fate that all of William's victims met. They found this victim 3 days later near a dumpster in Walnut. So apparently William had spent a month in jail at this point because he breached the rules of his parole conditions. I'm not sure how, but he was released again on March 4th. So just 10 days after he was released, he would claim another victim. Ugh, this is why I love science and technology. This right freaking here. If they had had the DNA testing back then, there is no way in hell that this guy would have ever been released. They would have nailed him, and he would have been put away before he was able to hurt any more young people. There was one night where William had met a 17-year-old named William Ray Pugh. They had met when they were leaving someone's house. Right after they drove away, William positioned Pugh for sexual relations. Apparently, this was shocking to Pugh, and after a few minutes of silence, he tried to get out of the van when it slowed down at a light. William grabbed Pugh by the collar and pulled him back into the seat. William told Pugh that he liked to kidnap and kill young men. William then told Pugh, as he dropped him off at his home, that the reason William didn't kill him is because there were people who had seen them leave that person's house together. After this, Pugh ended up becoming an accomplice to William. Unfortunately, with each victim came more brutality, and yet it was the same story again and again. He would lure a young man into the van with or without an accomplice. They would beat, sexually assault, rape, and torture the young man before ultimately killing the victim. There was one man named James Michael Monroe that William had invited to live with him and his mother, who shared an apartment because he was an 18-year-old drifter, to which James agreed because he needed a place to stay. They began a sexual relationship even though James was bisexual and had preferred to have sex with women. It was said at first James thought William was a good guy, until one day William told James he wanted him to help him kidnap and kill a young hitchhiker. William had told this to James on June 1st. On June 2nd, the pair came across a young man who was 18 and waiting at a bus stop. William lured this young man into the van. When William found out that this young man was bisexual, he offered him $200 to come back to his house and allow him to be bound before they had sex. The young man agreed, and once he was inside of the apartment, he was bound, raped, and beaten by both of the men. Before the young man was strangled to death, apparently William told him that he was about to be killed. The young man's body was put into a cardboard box, and it was taken to the home of Butts. When they took the body over there, William had encouraged Butts to look at the body. Then William allegedly asked Butts where he thought the best place would be to dump this body. Then Butts suggested that he drop him off where they, quote, dumped the last one. Yuck. The body was eventually left in the back of an old gas station that was no longer in use, and his body was found rather quickly, only about 5 hours after it had been left there. So William's torture, rape, and killing spree had lasted, unfortunately, around a year before he was caught. So I'm going to quickly go through the list of ages and dates so you can get a feel as to how often he was doing this and get a sense of how sick this fucker and his posse were. Then we'll move on from the worst part of the story. So, the first half is all in 1979. The first one was May 28, 1979. He was 13. August 4th, he was 17. August 5th, he was 17. August 27th, he was 15. September 9th, he was 17. September 17th, he was 18. November 1st was a John Doe, and he was said to be between 19 and 45 years old. November 30th, he was 17. December 10th, he was 15. January 1st, 1980, he was 16. February 3rd, he was 15. February 3rd again, and he was 12. March 14th, he was 18. March 21st, he was 14. March 21st again, he was 15. April 10th, he was 16. April 29th, he was 19. May 17th, he was 17. May 19th, he was 14. And June 2nd, and he was 18. This is the list of the confirmed victims. Pugh had been arrested for having stolen a car in May of 1980, and while he was in jail, he had admitted to his counselor that he had recognized the, quote, modus operandi of the murders that were on the news and those that had been previously described to him by William. Naturally, I had to look up what modus operandi meant, because in my head, it was the name of the van that William drove, and I was like, I've never heard of that kind of car before. Duh. Modus operandi or operandi means a particular method or way of doing something, which, after I learned that, made sense, but why didn't they just say that then instead? Anyways, there's your word for the day. The information that Pugh had told his counselor was passed on to the authorities, who in turn interviewed Pugh themselves. He had denied any involvement in the actual murders themselves, but he claimed to the authorities that William Bonin was the Freeway killer. After the authorities looked into William's background, that's when they realized that William had already an extensive criminal history that had involved sexual assaults of young boys. After this, they put William under surveillance. So had Pugh not told his counselor about William and what he knew, I wonder how long that this would have went on until he was finally caught. The victim list that I just went through of confirmed victims is 21. So absolutely sickening and terrifying. While William was actually under surveillance, the police had noticed that William was randomly driving throughout Hollywood on the 11th of June. It seemed to the authorities that he was trying to lure teenage boys into his van with him. After the police had watched William fail 4 separate times, he had finally convinced one young man to get into the vehicle, and police followed William until he had parked in a parking lot near the Hollywood Freeway. The police stealthily approached the vehicle, and when they had heard muffled screams and banging sounds coming from inside of the van, they forced their way in, and William was in the process of raping the young man who was said to be the age of 15. I'm sorry, I am so glad that the police were able to catch this piece of shit, but why couldn't they arrest him when he took the boy? Why couldn't they bring him in for questioning when they saw that he was trying to lure young men into his van? You had someone tell you he was a witness to this man being a serial rapist and killer, and you couldn't arrest him when you saw him trying to get a teenager? Or when he finally got one? I was so pissed when I read this that this boy had to go through the process of actually being raped before he was saved, and thankfully he was, but what the fuck? I always try to see both sides of things in almost every single situation to understand why people are the way they are. So I thought maybe they couldn't risk tipping him off and not being able to keep him in jail if they didn't have enough evidence. Maybe they couldn't pull him over for picking up a teenage boy because it wasn't really a crime. Maybe they wanted to make sure the charges stuck. I don't know. I'm not a police officer, so I'm sure I'm just talking out of my ass. But why did they have to stealthily sneak up to the car? Why couldn't they be loud as fuck so he wouldn't rape this poor kid? Maybe they were afraid that he would kill the young man? I don't know. Make it make sense to me because it is all kinds of fucked up in my head. After William was arrested and the authorities searched his home and his van for any evidence, and they were able to find numerous pieces of evidence that was suggesting that William Bonin was the Freeway killer. They found, quote, restraints, binding material, knives, pliers, and a tire iron. The things that they found in parts of William's house and inside of the van were heavily stained with blood. They even found some newspaper clippings that were about the murders inside of the glove box of his van. At first, when William was caught, he tried to deny being any part of the murders that he was being looked at for. Eventually, though, he gave in and confessed. Which, yeah, man, there's evidence galore against you. After authorities interviewed him over the span of several days, he finally admitted to the abduction, rape, and then murder of 21 young men and boys. Sick. William showed no remorse for his actions other than the fact that he was caught. However, he did quickly identify the names of his accomplices, Vernon Butts, James Monroe, and Gregory Miley. William was eventually charged with 16 counts of murder on July 29, 1980. Then he was also charged with 1 count of sodomy, 1 count of mayhem, and 11 counts of robbery. I'm not sure why he was only charged with 16 of the murders and not the full 21 like he had admitted to, so I was assuming that they didn't have enough physical evidence to link him to the other 5. I couldn't find information about why, so I'm not sure. On November 14th, Butts received 3 murder charges and he was scheduled for trial on July 27, 1981. James Monroe was arrested on July 31st, 1980, and he was charged with the murder of the last victim, to which he pled not guilty to all charges. Following this, Miley was arrested on August 22nd, and he was charged with 2 of the murders. There was apparently a phone conversation that Miley had with one of his friends that had been recorded, and during this call, he had admitted to being guilty. He at first pled not guilty, but then ended up changing his plea to guilty. William's first trial was finished on January 6, 1982, and at this point, he was found guilty of committing 10 murders. The sentencing had continued on until January 20th, and this is when William Bonin would be given the death penalty. Later on, he went to trial in Orange County, and he was charged with 4 murders. This trial actually lasted 6 weeks, and on August 2nd, 1983, he received a guilty verdict for all 4 of the murders, and also on 3 counts of robbery. He was also given the death penalty sentence for these as well. On January 11th, 1981, before he would go to trial, Vernon Butts committed suicide by hanging himself inside of his cell while he was incarcerated. James Monroe was given a sentence of 15 years to life for the murder of the last victim. Gregory Miley was sentenced to 25 years to life in February 1982 for the murder of one of the victims. Then he also received a 25-year term for the murder of a second victim. On May 25, 2016, Gregory Miley died from injuries that he had sustained from an attack from another inmate 2 days prior. William Pugh was handed a sentence of 6 years when he was found of being guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the murder of one of the victims. He only had to spend 4 years in prison before he was released in 1985. It was said that William spent 14 years waiting on death row before he was finally handed his execution date. He apparently had made a few friends on death row, which included a few other serial killers like Douglas Clark, Lawrence Bittaker, and Randy Kraft. At first, William was supposed to be executed by the gas chamber, but because there had been some issues with the previous execution in there, they changed it for William to lethal injection. If you're curious, William's last meal was 2 large pizzas, 3 pints of ice cream, and 18 cans of Coke. Holy crap, that's a lot of food. He also watched the show Jeopardy while he was eating. William chose to spend his last hours with 5 people, which included a chaplain, his attorney, and his biographer. The chaplain was quoted saying that he was willing to communicate, and he seemed relaxed. I don't think I could do a job where I had to go unbiased and talk to someone who tortured, raped, and killed little boys. No fucking way. I would have stabbed him right then and there to watch him suffer. Sorry, not sorry. William was taken to the gas chamber where he would be given the lethal injections at 11:45 p.m. It was said that his last words were, quote, "The death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand." And then he offered advice to anyone who had thought about doing illegal activity when he also said, quote, "And I would suggest when a person has thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." End quote. At 12:13 a.m., William Bonin was pronounced dead. Good. It was said during William's execution that there were both pro- and anti-capital punishment activists, which each included a few celebrities. They were going toe-to-toe with demonstrations outside of the prison walls of San Quentin. Apparently, William was the first person to die by lethal injection in the state of California. William was quoted saying, "They may feel that my death will bring closure, but that's not the case. They're going to find out." End quote. He just seemed like such an angry, sick little jerk who knew exactly what he was doing and didn't give 2 fucks what people thought. They said William had even had time to speak with a radio station in San Fran, and during the interview he told them he made peace with the fact that he was about to die and was said to even joke with the prison warden about that fact. I hate him. Many of the family members attended his execution to get some sort of closure for their losses. During the demonstrations for the pro- and anti-capital punishment, sheriff's deputies and correctional officers were dispatched all over in and out of the prison so they could help if there were any trouble from the activists and onlookers. There was said to be a middle school teacher, Mr. Levine, who was videotaping the demonstration so he could show his class at school, and he said that there were several children of the inmates, of the prisoners there, and the chaplain's son was even there. The school teacher, Mr. Levine, said he understood the pro-death penalty views, especially after he had talked to some of the relatives of some of the victims, but he still felt morally that the state shouldn't model killing. It said among the crowd there were opponents of the death penalty who carried candles, chanted, strummed guitars, and sang. There was said to be many shouting matches where people yelled insults back and forth. One woman said the tone of the demonstration was much angrier than any of the previous execution demonstrations she had previously attended. Well, I wonder why. If this man killed 21 young boys and tortured them, I would be angry too if I was there. One of the mothers of a victim was there and had said she couldn't wait to see William take his last breath and that she was upset that his death was going to be relatively painless. She then hugged a man who was a Santa Ana disc jockey who whom William Bonin had raped at gunpoint back in 1975 when the man was only 14. The mother of the victim also said she felt that William should be handed over to the parents of the victims, and she said they would quote-unquote fix him. One person who attended the demonstrations was a Catholic nun named Sister Catherine Vallejo, and she said, quote, "What he did to those children is wrong. Those children were our future. He's taken that away from us. But to take Bonin's life is not going to make anything right or teach us to be better human beings." End quote. I understand that what she probably meant is that violence shouldn't be answered with violence. It's just a rough situation. How do you guys feel about the death penalty? I am personally, and this is just my opinion, if they are 100% sure that the person is guilty of heinous crimes, especially anything to do with children, I am all for putting them down. I do understand that there are instances that people are sick and make mistakes, and that sometimes, like, if they're children themselves who commit the crimes, maybe if they can even be, like, rehabilitated or medicated and treated for mental health issues, then they're no longer going to be a danger to the people or themselves, that they could either be let go or, like, not put to death. It's a tough issue, and I wish that it weren't up to each state. Something that bothers me is I wish that the death penalty, again, just my opinion, was something that was spread across the country, one way or the other. I think it's kind of crappy for some of the families out there, if a person is killed, that their killer only gets like 25 years in one state, but if they had been in another one, they could be put to death. I think it should depend on the crime itself and the extent of the brutality and the number of victims, right? Like, anything kids, then kill them, period. I think it should be capital punishment all the way. I didn't know, though, and this is a tidbit that I learned not that long ago, that it's actually more expensive to execute somebody on death row than it is to just let them live their days out in prison. I didn't know that. I always just assumed it was the other way around, and I was like, this makes no sense to me. Like, why are we wasting our tax dollars on keeping this fucker alive if he just deserves to die? But apparently, it's the other way around. I don't think that anyone should be able to fuck around with anything that has to do with kids and then be let go. If they're a serial rapist, then castrate them, especially when it comes to children. Or they should be locked up for life. I know there's a high number of repeat offenders, and the chance of them doing it again is ridiculously high. Yet sometimes the justice system fails those victims and puts them right back out. Screw that. It is not fair. But like for this case, for William Bonin, I don't like that he got to live 14 years on death row. But I do know it takes a long time because they're encouraged to appeal, like they have to. And if they decide not to, they have to sign a lot of stuff. And I know they take a long time on death row because they want to make sure that they are guilty, etc. I know that it's happened where they've executed people who were not guilty. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. But I feel like if the evidence is there and somebody is found guilty, like by two separate juries like Bonin, and sentenced to death, put him down faster. I feel like it's just an extra waste of money if he's sitting on death row for 14 years and then executed. Like, that's just a slap in the face. I wish they would give it like a 2-year time limit. That's it. If you are sentenced to death, you get 2 years, whether you appeal or not. That's it. Again, it's just my opinion, and what the hell do I know? I am just a girl on a podcast living in my bubble of fear from people like this. Let me know what your opinion is on capital punishment or William Bonin on the Kill Files socials, and make sure to tag the podcast so I can see what you're saying and follow along in the conversations. I read the comments, so keep them coming. Let me know any thoughts you have. Also, I wanted to take a quick opportunity to ask my listeners to help out the Kill File by leaving 5-star reviews on platforms that you may listen to. This will help other true crime lovers find the Kill File. Also, you may have already heard, but we did drop some merch recently. I like how I say we as if it's anybody else. No, I am a one-woman show. So for the things that I do that might bother you, or for the very beginning of my podcast where the editing wasn't great or the time was choppy, just know that I am doing the best that I can. I am learning on the fly. It was a lot to learn, to build up my computer from the ground up first, to get the equipment to record the podcast, to learn how to do edits, to learn how to take breath sounds out. I mean, editing is insane. I had no idea for content creators how much time and effort goes into it. I understand now. So just keep in mind that I am still learning and I am doing the best that I can. So the merch did drop and the shop is on the Kill Files website. I also did a post about it in the socials. So you can also share and follow these podcasts on YouTube to help spread the word about the podcast. And I just wanted to tell you guys that I am so grateful to those of you who have already shared or reposted things on social media. I would love it if you guys would start a conversation about the episodes on social media to get the ball rolling and talk about them, especially after ones like today's story where it's heavy and so many feelings might be coming up for so many people. Share your thoughts, share your feelings. Let's open a discussion, and you can always email me with any thoughts, concerns, questions at thekillfilepodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you, even if it's constructive criticism. I am here for my audience. Tell me what you want, and thank you for listening. Bye. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!